There is always that fine line between courage and cowardice. Here, Dr. Stephen F Myler, in Part 3, looks at the senior police culture that causes much of the incompetence we see today, based on the insight of Norman Dixon's psychological theory. But when you're faced with a choice between telling the truth or suffering the consequences of exposing misconduct, it takes a certain kind of person to do the right thing. Here, using Norman Dixon's psychological insights, Dr. Stephen F Myler, PhD, gives us insight into the problems faced by the public when dealing with the police. This is an exploration of those rare individuals who exhibit the character and determination to stand up for truth and justice in the face of adversity, no matter how challenging or dangerous it may seem. So, welcome back. I want to explore the issue of whether there is a consistent thread of incompetence running through the ranks of senior police officers in the UK, whether it's due to poor leadership, inability to learn from mistakes, or even selection practices favoring certain types of personality over others. We've seen some pretty eyebrow-raising cases recently, from the Daniel Morgan scandal to the failings around Nick Adderley's appointment as Chief Constable. Now, I want to look at another example of a police officer whose conduct raises questions about the standards expected at the highest levels of UK policing. His story sheds light on some important aspects of this discussion and highlights the significance of continuous scrutiny and evaluation in professional settings, particularly in fields that demand the highest levels of integrity and competency. So, let's get into it. The case of Chief Constable Nick Adderley in 2021. Nick Adderley was appointed as Chief Constable of Hampshire Constabulary after serving in various senior roles in other forces, including Assistant Chief Constable of Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire. He was seen as a rising star in the police world. But soon after his appointment, questions began to arise regarding his academic qualifications and military service. Allegations surfaced claiming that he lied about having a degree and experience in the armed forces. The police watchdog group, the Independent Police Complaints Commission (IPCC), investigated these claims. And in January 2023, the IPCC upheld these complaints, finding that Adderley had breached standards of professional behavior in relation to honesty and integrity. As a result, he was ordered to be demoted with immediate effect. Now, while he is entitled to natural justice, and we should avoid jumping to conclusions, the scale of his deception as well as the casual manner in which it was uncovered raise concerning questions about his character and judgment. Let's start with the obvious. How did someone manage to climb the ranks of UK policing while lying about their qualifications? This suggests a systemic failure in the vetting process. Despite the fact that Adderley allegedly lied about his education and military career, he was consistently promoted. This points to a potential flaw in the vetting system. Either a lack of thoroughness or a misalignment of vetting practices with the actual needs of senior roles in policing. This case raises broader concerns about the robustness of the vetting procedures across all of UK policing. But then why do this in the first place? Why lie about qualifications that weren't there? Now here we step into the realm of motivation. Why does someone feel the need to embellish their background in this way? There can be many reasons, but in the context of policing, it could suggest a desperate attempt to conform to certain stereotypes or expectations that are sometimes associated with police leadership. It is often perceived that police leaders should exude a certain image of authority, discipline, and possibly even an air of invincibility. By projecting this image, officers can advance their careers, but in doing so, they risk sacrificing integrity. This case seems to suggest that the pressure to conform to a certain mold may be strong enough to push someone to engage in deceitful behavior, and it gets deeper. What happens when an incompetent officer makes it to a position of power? In Adderley's case, we don't know because he was removed before he could really settle into the role. But broadly speaking, incompetent leaders can have a disastrous impact on an organization. They can set the wrong direction for the entire force. They can undermine trust and morale, and they can easily cover up their mistakes, as they usually lack the self-awareness to recognize their own limitations. Going further, why are incompetent officers allowed to rise through the ranks? Part of the answer lies in the traditional practices of UK policing. Historically, the police have relied on informal networks and personal relationships to assess candidates. This often meant that promotions were based not just on merit, but also on loyalty and adherence to a particular culture. This sort of informal assessment can be problematic. It can lead to a sort of good old boy network where favoritism and groupthink prevail over competence and objectivity. Such practices can inadvertently promote incompetent officers who may lack the necessary skills and qualities to excel in higher ranks. And what happens when they get there? When incompetent officers reach the upper ranks of policing, they can create a ripple effect of harm. Their poor decisions can impact the effectiveness of entire departments, potentially leading to a breakdown in public trust and the overall weakening of the police force. Finally, the real question is, why do such incompetent officers often remain undetected for so long? This can be attributed to a variety of factors. First, there is often a reluctance among officers to speak up against their seniors. This can stem from a fear of being labelled as a troublemaker, a fear of damaging their own career prospects, or simply a respect for seniority. Additionally, the hierarchical nature of the police force can create a blind spot. Senior officers are often insulated from the day-to-day operations where their competence is actually tested. They can operate with a level of detachment that shields them from seeing the full impact of their decisions. Furthermore, the lack of senior police officers are generally better educated than those in other walks of life. This is because university education is increasingly becoming a requirement for joining the police force. But whilst the general level of education may be higher, this does not necessarily translate to higher quality thinking. You can have highly educated individuals who still suffer from rigid thinking, authoritarian tendencies, and parochialism. In fact, some might argue that this is more likely given that many of these traits are actually celebrated and selected for in the police culture. For example, university education often encourages critical thinking and questioning authority, whereas police culture prizes deference to hierarchy and acceptance of orders without question. Thus, while there may be a perception that the police are becoming more educated, it doesn't necessarily follow that they are becoming more competent. Many police leaders still display the same flawed traits that contribute to incompetence, such as resistance to change, unchallenged assumptions, and an inability to learn from past mistakes. It's important to analyze this issue because the quality of police leadership is crucial to effective policing. Incompetent senior officers can have disastrous consequences, leading to miscarriages of justice, erosion of public trust, and reputational damage to the police. Therefore, understanding the sources of incompetence in this context is not merely an academic exercise, but a matter of public interest. So let us discuss the ways in which the police's traditional outlook may be hindering their ability to produce competent leaders and causing them to fall short of expectations. The concept of learned incompetence. One way to understand the issue is through the concept of learned helplessness, popularized by psychologist Melody Wilding. This refers to a situation where people are so used to failing or being unable to improve their circumstances that they begin to expect failure and do not try to change things. In the context of the police, we could talk about learned incompetence. This idea suggests that due to the nature of the job and its culture, officers become accustomed to operating with a certain level of incompetence. They become resigned to the reality that things won't always go smoothly or according to plan. Therefore, instead of trying to do things better, they simply learn to cope with the incompetence and make the best of a bad situation. Authoritarian personality. Many psychologists agree that a predisposition toward authoritarianism is a trait that makes for an effective police officer. Authoritarianism refers to an attitude of strict obedience or compliance to authority, a belief in obeying rules and laws, and a preference for order and discipline. Such personalities often function well within hierarchical structures, which is why they tend to thrive in the police environment. However, while this personality type might be useful for operational efficiency, it becomes problematic when those officers reach positions of leadership. An authoritarian style of leadership doesn't encourage creativity, critical thinking, or the questioning of procedures. It discourages dissent and promotes conformity, which stifles innovation and prevents the acknowledgement of mistakes. The problem with parochialism. Another trait that can be considered positive in a police officer is detrimental in a leader. Parochialism refers to a narrow focus on the immediate interests of a particular group or community, while being loyal to one's colleagues and protective of their interests can be seen as positive qualities in a police officer. It becomes a problem when taken to extremes. Parochial police leaders become so focused on protecting their own that they lose sight of the broader goals of the organization and the needs of the wider community. They prioritize internal harmony and solidarity over challenging decisions or rocking the boat. Fear of failure and institutional reputation in the UK police culture, failure is often seen as worse than success. Making mistakes is viewed as a sign of weakness or incompetence, and can lead to a fear of taking risks or trying new approaches. When police leaders are promoted based on loyalty, obedience, and the successful upholding of the status quo, rather than on merit and competence, this fear of failure becomes widespread. In such an environment, learning from mistakes is replaced by a desire to avoid them entirely, which ultimately leads to a collective inability to improve. Conclusion: while the police have undoubtedly benefited from increased educational standards for new recruits, this alone does not guarantee the production of competent leaders. Traditional police culture, with its emphasis on authoritarianism, parochialism, and a fear of failure, can act as a counterweight to the benefits of education. Furthermore, if promotion within the police hierarchy is based more on loyalty and adherence to the status quo than on merit and competence, then the problem of incompetent senior officers is unlikely to disappear. Until the police are able to address these deeply ingrained cultural issues, they may continue to struggle with producing the competent, innovative, and adaptive leadership they need to function effectively and fairly. Now, check out this playlist on other topics related to the police. Part 4 coming up soon: Education and Commissioners. Does it change anything?